We believe that we can shorten the time for clinical trials because the noise level in the data is going to be reduced. Being able to then say, what is the impact on a complex condition and with a variety of confounding factors, and how can we get that insight clear so that we can get that drug approved as fast as possible? I think that's where you're going to see the shrinkage in the timeline and the cost, because you're applying insights from real world data all along the way.
That's Ed Seguine, CEO of Target RWE, and he's the co-founder of Clinical Inc. And I'm Josh Nelson, the head of healthcare at THL Partners. And this is Healthcare in Action. It's a podcast that explores the latest developments and innovations transforming the U.S. healthcare sector, from cutting-edge technology to thoughtful approaches to patient care. I'm here with my colleague, Jon Lange, who will lead us in a conversation about data and technology that's advancing clinical trials, and in particular, the opportunities for real-world evidence to generate insights that accelerate the development of new therapies and cures. Jon, take it away.
Thanks, Josh. In recent years, real-world evidence, or RWE, has gone from a buzzword to a strategic imperative in the pharma and biotech industries. Fueled by advances in technology and support from regulators and other key stakeholders, RWE is no longer just a tool for surveillance after drug approval. Instead, it's becoming a central pillar of how we understand the safety, effectiveness, and value of medicines in the real world. And it's increasingly influencing clinical trial design and supporting drug approvals. In fact, a recent JAMA article written by top FDA officials highlighted that a key priority for the current administration is to advance the drug development process by harnessing big data and, in particular, real-world evidence. And top companies in the industry have been investing heavily in real-world data partnerships to do just that and advance the clinical data landscape beyond traditional clinical trials. In today's episode, I'll speak with Ed Seguine, the CEO of Target RWE, one of the leading real-world evidence companies. From his early days as an investor to co-founding Clinical Inc., where he pioneered real-time point-of-care data capture for clinical trials, Ed has been a relentless force in advancing how we understand and manage clinical data. His work has touched some of the most complex and high-stakes areas in medicine, from Alzheimer's research to autoimmune diseases. And he's been a pioneer in rethinking how we use technology to better collect, structure, and apply clinical data. I was so pleased to have the chance to talk with Ed about his journey as the CEO of multiple companies, the changing landscape for real-world evidence, and all the opportunities ahead for technology to advance and accelerate the drug development process. So let's get into it. Ed, thank you so much for joining me today.
I really appreciate the invitation, Jon. I am looking forward to our conversation.
First, for people who aren't familiar, can you tell us a bit about Target RWE?
Target RWE is focused on collecting real-world data from healthcare settings to better inform and understand how is medicine practiced, what's the type of patients that deal with different conditions. And we do that by extracting the details of a physician's assessment of a patient's condition from unstructured notes in combination with the structured fields that you typically think of in an EMR that are the basics, like lab values, demographics, things like that, and then combine that to provide new ways of addressing novel research questions to say, is this an addressable question, and how did that impact a patient over time?
And maybe to make it even more concrete, can you give an example of maybe a drug or the journey of a clinical trial and how it was informed by real-world evidence?
So there's plenty of examples because this is a very common routine practice. Oftentimes you can get put into a situation like a catch-22, if you will, in a clinical trial, where in the case of liver, there's a condition called PBC, and that condition is relatively rare and severe. And there are 2 new drugs that have been recently approved. And they are now asking those companies to go back and run some placebo-controlled clinical trials. Well, I was just at a liver conference in Europe, and the hundreds of people that were there said this is totally unethical. Why would we give a patient who could benefit from this drug a 20% chance or 30% chance of going on a placebo when it is literally a life-threatening condition. And so that is what we're also trying to impact, is the ability to speed drugs to patients so they get them at the right time and they can be effective, but also not to get that tied up in the historical processes of how we've been doing things.
Got it. That's really interesting. And I think that frames up the role of real world evidence so well, because on one hand, you have the speed aspect where you've all this data happening, and you're able to collect it in the real world in addition to clinical trials. And so that should allow for, more speed to approvals of additional indications. But then also you raise this really interesting ethical question as well, which is, if you already know or should know from real world data that a drug is effective, that a drug is safe, then it really isn't ethical to be running a clinical trial, giving a bunch of people the placebo. You should be using the best data you have to get the best drug to the right people.
Correct.
So, maybe taking a step back, before you joined Target, you were the co-founder and longtime CEO of Clinical Inc. And so can you just tell us a bit about that company, how it came together, a bit of the history, and then how you ended up at Target?
Yes. So Clinical Inc., I was the co-founder with two other extremely talented individuals, and we started that company in 2012, and it was focused on the operational aspects of how to collect clinical trial data. And this was based on an experience at the time. I'd had about 10 years as an investor on the behalf of Eli Lilly's venture capital team in how to accelerate the operational infrastructure to conduct clinical trials. And I had sold a previous company to Metadata, which was one of the leaders in the space. But what we were really seeing at that time was simply a conversion of paper-based processes to an electronic process. So instead of collecting clinical trial data and writing it on paper and then writing it on another copy of the paper and sending it in, we had evolved to the point of writing it down on paper and then typing it into a web-based database, a glorified survey monkey, if you will, really. And in combination with my business partners, we said, there's got to be a better way to make this electronic from the moment that matters. During that patient visit, let's get it electronic. If we can do that, we can eliminate a lot of externalities and issues that come up with having to confirm what we recorded on the paper, really what is the data that got entered into the clinical trial. And then it really shifted to very rapid growth. And so for a period of 5 years, we were like 40% compound annual growth rate over, year over year for 5 years. That's a lot of change. And in that, we shifted and expanded to cover not just data collection at the site by physicians, but also data collection at home by patients. And our focus was really, how can we address the highest complexity therapeutic areas like Alzheimer's that had been highly resistant to, hundreds of clinical trials, but because they're very complicated to understand what's going on. And a lot of that complication came from the difficulty of implementing studies in that therapeutic area, focused on lupus and other neuroscience and autoimmune disorders, because our thinking was to just simply ask a couple of questions of patients like, hey, how well did you sleep last night? Or did you get sick after you took the drug? Like, that's simple. But to do the really complex things that have an indication on effectiveness and patient impact that required clinician judgment, that's what we built the platform to deal with, the highest complexity types of instruments.
And it's really interesting to hear you talk about the role of AI. And one thing that's come through in a handful of conversations recently is this dichotomy between AI addressing administrative problems versus clinical problems. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting in this use case that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're getting at is AI won't change the decision making. It won't replace a clinician, right, but it is so good at natural language and so good at organizing data that already exists that, for lack of a better word, has been a mess for the past 10, 20, 50 years, that if you're able to bring AI to bear in that sense, it makes the clinical decisions and the clinical trial decisions so much clearer, so much better, accelerates that process in a way that really advances medicine. Is that fair?
That is definitely fair. And that, think of even just the way someone would explain, how their day went. Everyone has a different way of talking. That obviously is still reflected in how physicians describe a patient. And so if you just turn AI loose on the unstructured notes of a clinical trial, you are still going to get a mess.
And maybe with that in mind, paint a picture for me of what success looks like 10 or 20 years down the road when we have brought AI to bear, when Target RWE and other companies have been able to make sense of a lot of the data, organize, manage the data in a way that hasn't been done before. What are the benefits? What does medicine look like when we have that success?
Right. An example would be how the dynamics change as different therapies come on. We'll just take a hypothetical. Everyone in the world now knows about GLP-1s. Like, okay, it's the obesity drugs that can lead to all kinds of weight loss. Well, in liver, guess what? That has totally changed the impact on liver disease because it's reducing fatty liver as well. And so if someone has an insight that says, hey, I think there's a way we can get to address this symptom, now they're going to have to figure out, like, how has that changed now that we've got essentially zero GLP-1 naive patients? Like, everybody who would need it has been on one. So how do we tease out the effect of our new drug from this one? So I have this insight. How do I understand what's changing in medical practice to now design my trial that accounts for that? And then ideally, having identified those anonymized patients, one of the great things that we can do is this flip on through some tokenization and see other encounters that particular patient has had in an anonymized way across health systems, literally then go back and consent them into a trial right away, knowing that they have the relevant characteristics. So we can now test this hypothesis in a particular kind of phenotype or profile of a patient that meets certain conditions to then say, we've now shortened the cycle of getting this additional insight. We believe that we can shorten the time for clinical trials because the noise level in the data is going to be reduced. And then your power on the number of patients you need you may need fewer of them to get the same certainty of that result because of how you've structured that then starts to accelerate. So there's a lot that we believe that have been talked about the same way, like the cost and the time of clinical trials. You can only go so far with operational improvements. That would be a clinical link kind of approach, which is still valid. You still need those. But being able to then say what we're really looking at is what is the impact on a complex condition and with a variety of confounding factors, and how can we get that insight clear so that we can get that drug approved as fast as possible? I think that's where you're going to see the shrinkage in the timeline and the cost because you're applying insights from real world data all along the way.
Great. Taking a step back, I am a real optimist about what real world data can do for medicine and ultimately for patient outcomes. What makes you most excited as you look out over the next 5, 10, 20 years about Target and about real world evidence?
I think that these are things that have been talked about and hoped for a long time, but the data hasn't been accessible. The data hasn't been widely available. And if you look back, it was only in a few short years ago in the Obama administration where there was this push to get everybody on electronic medical records. That means there needs to be a time frame of effective use before you're starting to even capture that data. So I think we're at a unique period of time where now when we do a look back period, we can actually gather some relevant information. And that with these additional insights will only get better. I don't believe that all of a sudden EMRs are going to just magically be more effectively documented. There's no possible way you're going to ask busy physicians to do greater documentation. And so there will still be an accepted kind of degree of messiness in the justifications of their clinical thinking that is just part of getting that business done. But if the technology can evolve to essentially access that and strip that out, we can give those insights back. And I get very excited about then being able to apply that to have new insights to address different conditions. One of the things in liver disease is that there's a symptom called pruritus, which is itchiness. And it's actually not documented well in the notes because to the physicians, it's like, yeah, well, we're going to try and treat your liver disease, but like it can be extreme. But if we can now start pulling these things out that matter to patients because we're solving some of the more basic issues, it gives us the ability to inform future development paths that give treatment options for people who have this, which is crazy. I was like, we're looking at this and it was really actually hard to find this. And we asked people like, well, we know they have it, but we just can't do anything about it. So we don't even document it. Like, it will have this virtuous cycle that helps to gather additional insights.
Ed, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much for joining me.
I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully people get something out of this as well.
Thank you for listening to Healthcare in Action, brought to you by THL. To help Healthcare in Action reach more listeners like you, either share this episode with a colleague, subscribe to the show, or rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And for more background on THL's healthcare vertical, visit thl.com/verticals/healthcare.